Hello everyone, welcome back. If you are new here, my name is Meg and today's video is just a little bit different. It's actually the presentation that I made for the Great Grow Along. If you've never heard of the Great Grow Along, it is a virtual garden festival. It just happened. It is an incredible source of information for gardeners. It spans over 3 weekends long. There's a lot of speakers and there's just so much information. Many of you messaged me saying that you really wanted to make it, but you weren't available at that time. So I'm also going to be posting it here as well. And the presentation is about how to plan for a food preservation garden this year. So without any further ado, here it is. Hello everyone, I want to thank you for being here. I'm Meg from Meg Grows Plants, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about planting for a food preservation garden. We're going to go over the different methods of preservation, the beginner-friendly crops that I recommend for a preservation garden, the different varieties that I recommend, and how much should you be planting. First of all, there are so many different methods out there for preservation, but I'm going to go over the most common ones today, and that is canning, both water bath and pressure canning, pickling, dehydrating, and freezing. Water bath canning is a method that involves submerging jars in boiling water for a specific period of time, creating a vacuum seal that prevents spoilage. This makes the jar's shelf life for up to 1 year. I know that a lot of people try to get by with a lot longer than that, and that's fine, but a good rule of thumb for all of these preservation methods is 1 year. This method is really only useful for those very high acid foods like tomato sauces, jams, jellies, and pickles. This is a tomato sauce that I made last year. It's going on about 7 months or so I really need to use it up soon. Pressure canning is essentially the same thing as water bath canning, except for you can can low acid foods with pressure canning because you are canning them in a pressure canner, which can achieve much higher temperatures than a water bath canner, and it can eliminate more bacteria that way. Pickling is a preservation method that involves submerging fruit or vegetables in a solution of vinegar, salt, sugar, and spices. The vinegar solution creates this acidic environment that prohibits the growth of many bacteria and microorganisms, while the salt helps maintain the texture and flavor. You can store pickles two ways. You can make fridge pickles and keep them in the refrigerator for up to 6 months, or you can water bath can them, and that makes them shelf stable for up to 1 year. And these are some pickled peppers that I water bath canned last year because my garden is always flowing with an abundance of peppers. Dehydrating is a process that removes moisture that inhibits bacterial growth and preserves for extended storage. You can dehydrate a wide variety of vegetables and herbs, and there's many different methods that you can achieve this. You can air dry, you can sun dry, or you can use a dehydrator, or you can even use your oven. This is some anise hyssop that I dehydrated for tea last year, one of my absolute favorite herbs to grow to have around for tea. And again, a good rule of thumb with this is that they will last for 1 year in an airtight container. Most of us know how freezing works. This involves bringing that temperature down to below freezing, which again inhibits the growth of bacteria, and you can pretty much freeze anything and it can last for, again, up to a year. A lot of people get away with more than a year. Rule of thumb is a year. There's many reasons that people may want to learn how to preserve their food, especially if you're a gardener. I mean, one, you can enjoy the fruits of your summer harvest even in the dead of winter, and you can eat food that is out of season, that you grew. Two, food security is a huge topic right now, and a lot of people are interested in learning how to preserve food so that they can rely less on the grocery stores, which is super valid. And three, it's not uncommon for gardeners to bite off way more than they can chew when they are gardening, and they overplant, and then they're harvesting all of this stuff and they're like, I don't want all of this food to go to waste. What do I do with it? How can I store it? How can I not let it spoil? And that is how I myself got into preserving food. Personally, for me, gardening is my therapy. I wouldn't say that food preservation is one of my main goals with gardening, but I do find myself every single year with an abundance of things for my garden because I have a pretty large garden, but only a small family of two, just me and my fiance. So I remember the first day I bought my canner, I had an entire counter full of tomatoes, and I was just like, what do I do? So I was like, I guess, you know, it's time. It's time to get a canner. And that was the day that I bought my very first canner. That was also the day that I bought my very first canning and preserving book, which is this Ball book of home preserving. And I really recommend this to any beginner because this is the book that taught me all about preserving. It is an incredible resource. It's filled with hundreds of really great recipes that I still use today, and I just couldn't recommend it enough. Before we talk about which plants to plant and how much, it's important to think about what your goals are with preserving. Why do you want to do this? Do you want to do it just for fun? Do you want to do it so that you have food that you can eat on all winter long? Are you on a path to complete self-sufficiency? You just want to really think about that. You also want to think about your gardening space, how big it is, and if it aligns with your preservation goals. And most importantly, you're going to think about the things that you genuinely like to eat and would like to preserve. You want to think about what you're gonna pull out of your, preservation pantry or whatever in the dead of winter, and you're gonna be happy about it. If you're somebody that's not really big on pickles, but then you spend all summer canning a bunch of pickles, it could all go to waste. So just think about what you genuinely love to eat. You can find a way to preserve almost any crop, but today I'm just gonna go over the basics. I'm gonna stick to the beginner-friendly crops to preserve. First up, we have tomatoes, and tomatoes are really versatile and they can be preserved using all of the methods that we talked about. I mean, you can water bath can them to make some tomato sauce or salsa. You can pressure can them. You can pickle them. One of my favorite things to do is at the end of the season when you have a ton of little green tomatoes. Those are really delicious pickled. You can dehydrate them to make some sun-dried tomatoes or preserve them in oil. You can even make tomato powder. You can do everything. You can freeze them as well. So they are super versatile and should definitely be on the list. There are a few varieties of tomatoes out there that are best for preserving, and we mainly call these paste tomatoes. I have a couple of favorite varieties that I always have in my garden. First one is Roma. These are really great for sauce and salsa, and I also like San Marzano, which is great for sauce and salsa, but also great for sun drying. We call these paste tomatoes because they are great for making tomato paste, tomato sauce. They have thicker skins and less water content, so their flavor is much more concentrated, and that's what makes them really great for preserving. Most paste tomatoes, like the Roma, are determinate tomatoes, which means that they have a determined amount of fruit that they are going to set, and they usually set it all at once, which is really convenient for us that want to preserve them to make sauce, because when we make a big batch of sauce, we need a lot of tomatoes all at once. Some other paste tomato varieties, like the San Marzano, are indeterminate, meaning that they don't really have a determined set of fruit that they're going to produce. They will produce all season long up until the first frost, and so that means that they are putting out a continuous, steady harvest. It's not so much all at once like with the determinate varieties. So I like to plant a mix of both in my garden. I also just want to note that the determinate varieties are a much more compact, shorter plant. They don't really get above 3 or 4 feet tall. So they're great for people that are short on space, balcony gardeners, anybody that doesn't want to have to use a ladder to harvest their tomatoes at the end of the season like I do with my San Marzanos, because indeterminate tomatoes, they can get quite tall. I mean, I quite literally had to harvest them one year with a ladder. Since I grow both varieties, I'm often having tomatoes coming in at different times, and that's okay because there is a little trick that you can do. So say you want to make a batch of sauce or salsa and you need a lot of tomatoes, but they're coming in at different times, you can just pop them in the freezer whole. There's nothing that you have to do to them special. Just pop them in the freezer and then wait until you have enough tomatoes in the freezer to take them out and make a batch of salsa. And actually freezing them can make it really easy to remove those skins as well. So just a little pro tip. Now, all of this is not to say that you have to plant paste tomatoes to preserve them. You can preserve any variety of tomato. Just keep in mind that if you're making sauce with like a non-paste tomato, it might be a little bit more watery just because there's more water content. It might not have as much flavor, as much richness as a paste tomato could, but it's still totally preservable. When you're trying to plan out how many tomato plants you want to grow, I would suggest at the very least you need about 5 tomato plants, and that could get you a couple of good canning projects going. You can make a couple of batches of sauce or salsa. You could dehydrate some, maybe do some sun-dried tomatoes, and then you could pickle the green tomatoes at the end of the year. But if you're looking for like total tomato self-sufficiency, you're gonna need to plant much more than that. And that's just gonna depend on your goals and the size of your garden. Personally, for me this year, I am planning, but I don't know what the final number is gonna be. I'm planning on planting 10 tomato plants. 5 of those are going to be Romas, and 2 of them are going to be San Marzanos. And I'm not somebody that really relies on a lot of tomato preservation. I like to just have enough pasta sauce that I can have some really great tomato pasta in the middle of the winter. I like to have a couple jars of salsa on hand, and I like my sun-dried tomatoes as well. But it's not something that I want to, fill my shelves with. I actually do most of my tomato preserving by making a huge batch of tomato soup and freezing it, because tomato soup is like one of my all-time favorite things ever. I eat tomato soup like once a week. Peppers fall into the same category as tomatoes as far as their versatility. You can preserve them in any way that you could think of. Jams, jellies, pickled peppers, dehydrated peppers, pepper powder, fermented hot sauce, you name it, you can do it with peppers, and that's why peppers are one of my all-time favorite things to grow. One of my favorite things about peppers is how long they can last ripe on the plant. So you aren't running into the issue of, oh my gosh, this is ripe, I have to pick it and do something with it today or it's gonna go bad. Peppers can stay on the plant for a very long time. They kind of tend to ripen all at once later in the season, like determinate tomatoes, but the fact that they can actually stay on the plant longer, it just gives you a much larger window to harvest and preserve them. Peppers can either be harvested when they are totally and completely ripe or when they are still green. It just depends on the type of pepper and what kind of flavor profile you're going for. There aren't really any specific pepper varieties that are best for preserving, because you can really preserve any kind of pepper. I've experimented with every kind of pepper you can think of. I think in my gardening journey, I have grown over 30 different varieties of peppers, and all of them have preserved extremely well. But I will say that the most common pepper for preserving is definitely the jalapeno. Again, it's just so versatile. You can make jam, jelly, you can dry it out. If it's dehydrated, it's actually called a chipotle, and it's so widely used. Another popular pepper for preserving is the cayenne pepper, and I like to grow a lot of these because I really like cayenne pepper powder. They're very easy to dehydrate and turn into your very own pepper powder. Some of my other favorites are Italian sweet peppers like Jimmy Nardello's, some more other spicy peppers like serranos, poblanos, and Thai chilies. Since my main pepper that I love to use are jalapenos, I always make sure to plant at least 4 to 5 of those, and that seems to give me enough for all of my hot sauce that I love to make, my jams, my jellies, all of the above, and then still have some for fresh eating. Other peppers that I still love but I don't use quite as much, I'll have like 1 to 2 plants each of those, and I tend to have a lot of different pepper variety in my garden. Like I said, I've trialed over 30 different types of varieties of peppers, and I usually have maybe 10 to 12 peppers each season, and I try to kind of like have new varieties to try each year. Cucumbers are another crop that are quite famous for preserving because we all love cucumber pickles. Personally, I couldn't imagine my life without pickles. Any pickle for that matter, any kind of vegetable pickle. Pickling is arguably my favorite way to preserve food. If you're wanting to preserve cucumbers, choosing the right variety is really important with cucumbers. For pickling, you want to go with a pickling variety. I think the most common pickling variety is the Boston pickling cucumber, but there are loads of different varieties out there. A pickling cucumber is going to have thicker skin with less water content, much like the paste tomatoes, and that's going to make for a crispier, crunchier pickle, which is exactly what we want in a pickle, because Who wants a soggy pickle, right? There are also different sizes of pickling cucumbers to think about. Do you want a smaller, crunchier little gherkin, or do you want to make longer spears or chips, or a combination of both? I find that the slicing varieties of cucumbers do not make good pickles at all. They will be very soggy, but they're really good for fresh eating. But you can still preserve them if you make relish, and you can make relish and water bath can those. Figuring out how many cucumber plants we want to plant can be kind of tricky because we can't really freeze cucumbers like we can with our little tomato trick, and cucumbers really need to be harvested right in their peak of freshness to stay crunchy as a pickle. It's kind of difficult because you don't want to harvest them too early, you don't want to harvest them too late. You have to harvest them like very perfectly. So you need lots of plants producing at the same time if you're gonna get enough, really prime cucumbers to pickle. If you're wanting to make shelf-stable pickles in large batches that you can store away on the shelf, you're gonna have to water bath can them, and I would recommend at least 5 plants. That way you have enough cucumbers that are producing at the same time that you can harvest at that peak of freshness and make a large batch like that. But there is a way that you can get away with pickling even if you are short on space, and that is by making refrigerator pickles. And what I usually do every summer is I will make a pickling brine, and I'll put it in a large jug. I think it's like a half a gallon jug. And every day, as I'm harvesting cucumbers, I'll slice them up and I'll just throw them in the jar. Those are able to stay in the fridge for about 6 months. And actually, I won't even just do this with cucumbers. I'll do any vegetable. I'll throw in some carrots, green tomatoes, beets, like beans, anything. I'll just throw in there. So it's just like a huge pot of pickled mixed vegetables. And if that's all you're kind of aiming for, you can get away with planting less plants. Herbs are really great for preserving because they add flavor to your cooking. And when you grow your own at home to make your own spices, it's actually a huge cost saver. Because I don't know if you've been to the grocery store recently and you've seen the prices of spices lately, but it is, whew, it's astronomical. Not only can you use herbs to cook with, but they can be used in your canning and pickling recipes as well, and they are usually dried out or dehydrated to store. You can really dehydrate any herb to use and add to your spice rack, but some common herbs that are used in other preservation methods that I'm going to go over today are dill, oregano, basil, and cilantro. Dill, as we know, is amazing in cucumber pickles. Basil and oregano are typically used in tomato sauces, and then cilantro is typically used in salsa. So they're just really great preservation herbs to have on hand. A lot of herbs also make great companion plants in the garden for other crops, and typically I will plant my herbs in between other crops. Like for instance, I always plant basil with my tomatoes. I'll plant them in between or around as a border, and I always try to fill out any border of any garden bed with companion plants like herbs. I just feel like it's almost giving your main crops that you're planting in the center, it's kind of giving them like a little insect shield, which usually works out great for me. Depending on what you like and what you want to preserve the most, I typically try to have several plants of each of these herbs just so that I have enough for a continuous harvest. And I'm also making sure to succession sow these herbs every few weeks or so, because herbs can be kind of finicky and they can kind of, you can plant them, they'll have this big flush, and then they can kind of die out, or they can go to flower, they can bolt, and then you might just need to replant them to get the freshest herbs possible. However, everything I just said does not apply to oregano. For me, one oregano plant usually is enough because oregano is in the mint family, and anything in the mint family can be very invasive, and you want to try to contain it. I wouldn't plant it in your garden beds with your other plants. I would plant it in a separate container because it can be pretty invasive, just like mint and lemon balm, anything in the mint family. When we're trying to preserve herbs, we want to keep them from bolting as long as we possibly can. And bolting is just going to flower. Because when we're using these herbs, we are trying to use the leaves of the herbs for our cooking. We're not using the flowers. So we just want to try to prolong that flowering as long as possible. And sometimes that's not really easy because as soon as it starts warming up, a lot of these herbs want to flower, and that's not their fault. But there are some different varieties that you can buy that can prolong that flowering, and usually these are called slow bolting varieties. So for instance, when you're looking at seeds, look for a slow bolting basil variety, slow bolting dill, slow bolting cilantro, and slow bolting oregano. One thing you can do to kind of stave off bolting is you can harvest frequently. If you are trimming your herbs pretty frequently, that can kind of slow down the bolting process, although some herbs are still very determined and they're gonna bolt no matter how much you harvest. So that's why I always tend to succession sow, just to make sure, just to have an insurance policy on my herbs. For preservation, I think 2 to 3 plants of each can get you enough to preserve and add to your spice rack, but in my opinion, the more herbs, the merrier. Not only for companion planting, but for us that are trying to dry them out and add to our spice rack and use them in canning. It's just, you can never go wrong with planting too many herbs. You really can't. Before we wrap it up, I just want to briefly mention plants that can store for a very long time by themselves, no preservation needed. With proper curing techniques, these crops can store for months and months on end, and they're just so easy to grow, so I do think that they are worth mentioning. Curing is the process that these crops go through in order to prepare them to store for a long time. And curing is basically just laying them out in a good, well-vented area with a lot of circulation, and this toughens the skin and it kind of just like seals everything in place to prevent them from rotting. One of my all-time favorite crops for this is definitely pumpkins. I grew this Seminole pumpkin last year. It has been sitting on my counter for a good 8, 9 months now, and if you cure them properly, they can store for up to a year. I've even heard of over a year, and that's so cool. The Seminole pumpkin is an amazing variety. I harvested 20 of these last year off of just one plant, and I have been eating on these things the entire winter. I'm actually so sick of pumpkin right now. That's why I haven't eaten this one yet. That's actually a very good thing because that means that I had food to eat from my garden all winter long, which is what we are looking for with this entire presentation. And yes, if I were to cut this open and bake it, it would be just as fresh as the day that I harvested it. Some other really great crops that store well are a lot of root crops like potatoes, sweet potatoes. Those can last for up to 6 months. Onions as well, and garlic. If you are a total beginner with all of this, I recommend that you start small. Don't overdo it. Don't get overwhelmed. If even this overwhelmed you, the one thing that I would recommend starting with are the herbs. Learn how to dry out herbs, make your own spices, and then go from there. Now you guys should have a pretty good idea of the different food preservation techniques, what crops to grow, and how to plan your food preservation garden. I want to thank the Great Grow Along for having me. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and here is where you can find me.